So welcome, I'm Carol Damian. I'm the director of the Frost Art Museum, and I welcome you here, and I know for a few of you it's the first time you've ever been here. And it's quite an extraordinary place. We've been open 4 years, and it's in those 4 years, I don't know how many exhibits we've had, it's too many to count. Lots of exhibits, lots of programs, very successful events. And I'm also, in addition to being the director of the museum, I'm also an art historian. And I work with the subject of women artists, women in art. So over the year, over the semester, I've been asked by a number of classes in the university and outside the university to kind of talk a little bit about what I talk about in that class. And the premise of the class is right there. So it's really fun to kind of take from different sources and to do a bit of a survey. The reason I'm teaching this class now is that we have had, over the course of the year, extraordinary exhibits by women artists. And so it was just so appropriate when we were scheduling classes for me to say to the chairperson of the department, you know, I want to teach my Women in Art course because it's one of the few times I'll be able to actually teach in place, to take the students into the galleries and to actually look at the work. So over the course of the semester, we've really had an extraordinary group of women artists, and some of whom I'm going to talk about today. But perhaps the most exciting thing that is happening is that on Saturday, we are opening the work of Ursula von Friedensgaard. If you don't know who she is, you have to see this exhibit. And in fact, I'm not supposed to do this, but I will open the doors to the exhibit where they're installing and let those of you who want to take a peek, take a peek. Because once you see this, you're not going to believe it. We've had reporters here today, and you know, they walk in and they say, wow. I mean, it's like nothing you've ever seen if you don't know her work. So she was also very inspirational for my doing the class because it's the last class of the semester on Saturday when she's going to be here talking about her work, and we officially open the exhibit. So I told my students, you know, this is what the class is about. You better be here on Saturday afternoon because if you miss Ursula, you're really missing something.
What time?
So 4 o'clock, she's going to be speaking in the Green Library, which is the auditorium at the library, right across campus, where, for those of you who are familiar with our Wonderful Critics lecture series, we used to do all our lectures in there. And then we just walk over here. You can still park in the gold garage or the blue garage, walk to the library, which is the tallest building on campus, very easy to find, and then we'll all walk back here. We will also have little golf carts and the Panther shuttle to take people back and forth who don't want to walk, but it's not far. So she's going to be here at 4 o'clock on Saturday to introduce her work. So as I said, that's really, you know, the highlight of so many of the extraordinary women that we've exhibited this whole year, especially this semester. I also wanted to welcome the Dade County teachers. I know many of you are teachers, and this is part of your credit to come to these lectures. And there is a sign-in sheet with all the information in front, so please be sure and sign in so that we can report that to the school board as well, that you've been here. So, without any further ado, let me introduce my subject of women artists, and I'm introducing this first slide with the work of Cindy Sherman. And I chose Cindy Sherman because, as many of you may know, she is having a retrospective right now at the Museum of Modern Art in New York that is of great critical acclaim. I mean, it's been everywhere. And one of the most amazing artists, a woman who takes on different identities. So she's kind of a perfect place to start because we're going to be talking about women artists who also take on different identities identify with different personalities as they make their way through the whole history of art. The course that I teach is not about women artists. It's not the history of women artists at all. It's called Women in Art, because I start way back in the prehistoric period and just introduce the subject of women in art. The woman as the subject, the woman perhaps as the artist, but as you know, we don't really know who artists are until a very modern period of time. So what I do is I assume that a lot of the work is made by women. Yeah, well, I can, you know, they're not alive to tell me that I can't do it. So this is the course that I teach, just to give you an idea of the kinds of subject matter that we deal with. The subject of women, Venus, very important subject. You can see Botticelli's Venus up there. Portraits, also incredibly important by women artists. Women were very, very skilled at doing portraiture when they were not allowed to do other things. The Nike of Samothrace, another iconic image of a very important woman, because she was the goddess of victory and still is Nike. You know, probably a bunch of people in here are wearing her little sign on their clothes. Of course, Frida Kahlo, because Frida has become so very popular. She's very much a cult figure. And because she leads me into another subject, and that is that in September, I'm going to be taking a group to Mexico City and Frida Kahlo is pretty much going to be the star of this week of things that we're doing in Mexico City, because there happens to be an exhibit opening on September 25th or so that is about women surrealists in Mexico. So if you know anything about the surrealists, the women surrealists like Leonora Carrington, Remedios Varo, Frida Kahlo, Maria Izquierdo, Mexico is really an extraordinary place. So that exhibit is opening in California in the summer, and then it's traveling back to Mexico, because it really is originated, the works originate in Mexico. Go to California, they're going back to Mexico. So we're going to be visiting that particular exhibit and seeing and also the Blue House and where Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera lived. Then on the bottom right is a work that we just took down a couple of weeks ago as part of our French Tour de France exhibit, our French exhibit that was French art in Miami collection. And this is the work of Orlan. And Orlan is a French artist who literally, talk about shape-shifting, she literally becomes another person through plastic surgery. So whereas Cindy Sherman becomes another person because she takes on the guise, the costumes, the environment of her subject, with Orlan, she literally goes through plastic surgery to change her physiognomy. In this particular one, she becomes an American Indian. We had another piece in the show where she becomes a Maya, and they both have very different physiognomies. And she literally goes under the knife, has her nose built up, I mean, honestly. So she is another quite extraordinary woman that we got to know. She visited a couple of times during Art Basel last year, and she was as outrageous as one can imagine. In fact, and Martin, you were there for the Art Basel breakfast. Remember when she walked? I was sitting in the front row, and the speaker had already started. We did this big breakfast in the park during Art Basel, and the speaker had started, and I saw her kind of standing over there, and I, motioned her to come and sit next to me. So she kind of walked through, and everybody was like looking at this person, including my children, who said, "Mom, what was that?" Because she still had some of the implants on her cheeks from the Maya series, where she literally implanted on her cheeks to build up her cheekbones, and then she had little, like, semi-precious stones in them. So, this takes tattooing to a whole new level. It made all the kids that are tattooed around this campus look like the nursery school. I mean, this was really serious. So anyway, we had a good time with Orlan. So as I consider the role of women artists, I don't have to tell you that throughout the history of art, women have played a marginal role. That they're more often regarded as objects for male contemplation than they are for themselves and their accomplishments. Men and women throughout history have had very dissimilar roles. And here we are in the 21st century, and it's just unbelievable. We're still fighting some of these battles, but we are. And it really is not until the 70s that the feminist movement changes this. I mean, it really, this attitude that a woman is not equal, that a woman cannot make decisions for herself, that a woman should not be an artist. It doesn't change until the feminists get a hold of this subject in the 1970s. So the question really that we always ask ourselves, especially the students, I tell them, ask yourself this: why? Why did this happen? Why did art historians ignore women artists and revere men as the heroes? Because as you're going to see in 40 minutes, there were a lot of really important women artists in history. And when they started to write the history books, and in the original history books, Vasari, for instance, the lives of the artists, he included all these women. And then over the years, the Renaissance women, obviously, that I'm talking about, Renaissance and Baroque, and then after the 16th century, when art history books began, or documents, began to be written following in Vasari's path, more and more compendiums of artists, like dictionaries of artists, would be published. And then when we get into the 20th century, when the educational systems included history of art in their programs, then more art history texts are written. As we get into the middle of the 20th century, there were a number of art history texts, and those of you who took art history in college may remember Jansen and Gardner, Honor and Fleming. Those were the classic books. I know when I went to school in the Dark Ages, and I studied art history, I used both Jansen, the Key Monuments of the History of Art, and the History of Art by Jansen. Not one woman artist. Not one. Not even George O'Keeffe. No one. No one. And that was in the 60s. The 70s come along, and the feminists change all that. They begin to protest, they begin to boycott those books, and finally, other art history books are published, and we get the tokenism, where the first Jansen, revised Jansen, comes out and puts in George O'Keeffe. She's the only one. And we're supposed to be satisfied with that. And then over the years, by demanding that more and more artists be included, more and more artists were included. And it was really Marilyn Stockstad, I don't have to tell you, Marilyn Stockstad, who wrote major art history texts and put all of these artists back in. Shocking. Shocking to see how many artists there really were in history. So my job as a teacher was to do that, to introduce these artists to my students, and every day I would say to them, did you ever hear of this artist? Do you know she made more money than Rembrandt? And they would be shocked. So our job, and I bet Shazette, you're the only, oh, Miriam and Shazette, two of my students here. That happens a lot, right, as we're going through the course. That it was like, did you know who this woman was? That she was the most important artist in Europe? Nobody knew of her. So now, the reason that I teach this class, and you know, you have to ask the question also, why do you teach a class about women artists? Aren't you just marginalizing them even more? Well, you know what, if you don't do it, it's never going to get done. And furthermore, by at least recognizing that, it's a first step. So you would hope that as other history of art books are written, that they would be included in the history of art books, which is happening. It really is happening. So, as I said, I bet you cannot name many. until the 20th century, of course, and then you can start with George O'Keeffe and name a lot. But we are going to find out that women, the role of women, the woman as the artist, the subject of women in art was very, very significant. And I think that this is another quote that also sort of sets the scene for this discrimination against women artists, when the great artist Albrecht Dürer in 1520 purchases a miniature. Women artists are very good at making miniatures because they aren't allowed in studios. They can't go into the big classes in the academies, so they stay home, and it's easy to paint little things. So they really become expert, and in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, portraiture and miniatures were incredibly important. We sort of dismiss it nowadays. We're not used to looking at little miniatures or appreciating what they are, but in their day, they were very important, so there were important women artists who were doing it. So he buys one, and this is what he has to say. It's a marvel that a woman can do so much. So these negative attitudes occur throughout history, that a woman can never be a genius. And why can't she ever be a genius? She's not recognized as a genius because she's never given a chance. There are so many restrictions upon her. Why have there been no great women artists? The restrictions. A woman is expected to have a family, to stay home, take care of the house, and she's not allowed to have the same educational opportunities as a man. So these are very restricted. There are less girls. Women were married at age 15, so they hardly have a chance at a career. The life expectancy was low. So, you know, we've been talking in the class about Louise Nevelson, Louise Bourgeois, George O'Keeffe, these great women who are working until they're 90. Well, these women die at the age of 30. So obviously they don't have time to raise their kids and pursue a career as an artist. The economic and legal rights also restrict the ability of them to have careers. They're simply not allowed to do this. It's not respected to have a career. And it's certainly not respected to have a career as an artist. I mean, it's like, even today, we're still battling at the university with parents who say, my kid wants to be an artist. Oh my gosh, that's horrible. They don't want him to be an artist. So those of us in the arts are always defending the fact that it's good to be an artist. And why are artists artists? Because they have to be, right? Right? You have to do it. Looking at my artist friends here. You have to do it. It's like inside of you. Right? Isn't that why you're an artist? Because you have to be an artist. So, between restrictions, acceptable norms of society, social class obligations that told the woman how they should look, what they should say, what they should do, where they should go, it was hard. And of course, the academic training was impossible. And we know from the days of the Renaissance that artists were trained in the academy. And the academy was very, very restrictive when it came to women, all the way into the 19th century. Maybe there was a token woman here or there, but if there was a token woman allowed into the Italian Academy, say Bologna, which was very, very progressive, and there were a few women in those academies. However, and in the French Academy, there was the token, Bijou Lebrun and Adelaide. But even though they might be allowed in the academy, they were not allowed in any live model classes. They couldn't paint the nudes. Okay, if you can't paint a nude, how do you paint the figure? How do you compete with the man who understands the anatomy of the figure? So women were very good at painting themselves, painting their sisters, somebody that they could see looking at themselves in the mirror. But even if they do that, they don't have the master by their side saying, you know, that leg is a little long, you should really look at the way the hip fits into this, and, you know, really understanding anatomy. They couldn't do it. So already they're lacking in a certain skill. They had these funny regulations where they weren't allowed to paint anything that was romantic. Very important part of art history is romanticism, but you know, we wouldn't want them to be titillated with anything that was a little romantic. So you had to stay away from any romantic subject matter. Mythology, I think mythology is really sexy when you think of it. Very sexy. All those gods and goddesses running around nude. Hey. So the women weren't supposed to be dealing with any kind of mythology. They couldn't paint even history paintings, because history paintings were grand scale, and they didn't know how to put a composition together because nobody had ever taught them. So when you start to think about what happens in the academy, you can understand how the women are more and more restricted as to how they learn and how they can compete with the men. So as we study the history of women in the arts, and as I said, not only the women artists, but I have to, and I can't overstress the significance of women as a subject. All the way back to the Paleolithic period, the woman was the creator. The woman was the fertility goddess. The woman was the earth goddess. The woman was the sky goddess. The woman took charge of creation. It was very mysterious, but it was certainly important. And the earliest peoples recognized that there was somebody looking after their fertility. Can you imagine how hard it was to bring a baby to full term and for a baby to survive? Can you imagine how hard it was to even breed the animals and make sure there are enough animals survive to feed you, breeding animals? Can you imagine if the corn crop dies? If the wheat dies? This is all fertility. So it isn't only the fertility of the physical, it was the fertility of nature. And it was this woman, goddess, who was in charge of all this. So, considered one of the earliest images in the history of art, which is where a lot of art history starts, it is this little statue of the goddess of Willendorf. Little, it's only this big, very tiny, but you can see by the physiognomy of this statue that the fertile aspects of the female body are exaggerated. She's generic, she doesn't have a face, she's not a portrait, she's not somebody distinct. She is fertility. She's everything that is recognizable and associated with fertility. And these little goddesses were very ubiquitous. Very, very few male figures have been found. Occasionally male figures are found, and they might be associated with a musical instrument, because what were they doing? They were worshiping the goddess. So they were offering to the goddess. So the mystery of the goddess, these goddesses of stone, this great mother goddess, is associated with the fact that she gives birth to all creation. Throughout the world, just because of Venus of Willendorf or the goddesses of Austria or Spain or Germany are well known to us does not mean that they weren't in other places as well, because they're found literally all over the world. So there's evidence of these female goddesses or the worship of nature that go back 200,000 years. This is an old story, a very old story. The woman associated with caves, because so many cultures believe that we come out of the cave of the earth. We come out of the mountain into the cave. Rock art, where the little figures are found, where the cave paintings are, little figures are found at the entranceway. It's like they're protecting the animals and what's going on inside of the caves. Little figurines, carvings, carvings on the wall, independent carvings, all small. They're very small, because these are nomadic people. They can't build a very big statue. So they build little things that they can take with them. I like to think also that with these little figures, because so many of them have like little legs that are almost like prongs, that they could sit right by, in the sand, by where they sleep, and they would put them right next to their pillow and carry them with them. and have this little figure. And it's not really far-fetched because they're still, think of how many saints, images, icons people have associated with where they sleep, where they eat. You know, you associate a particular figure. So maybe that's the reason for the way their legs are configured, kind of like this, so they can actually stick into something, because they can't stand, you know, on those little legs. So they were used. We know that some of the very earliest women, goddesses of stone, appear with figurines also 400,000 years ago in Jerusalem. 60,000 years ago, bodies and graves indicate that there were rituals, the bodies were painted. They're painted usually with cinnabar, rubbed with cinnabar, which is red. Menstrual blood is red. It's all about fertility. Women were buried facing toward the rising full moon. The moon, very important because the menstrual cycles are associated with the moon. So the symbolism of the moon also occurs at this time. So it's really 30,000 that you get the Paleolithic, the rock imagery of the caves. Then as we continue through history, some of the most extraordinary of these goddesses emerge in the historic period where we actually have writing associated with the culture of Mesopotamia, for instance. We know who she is. She's Lilith from Isin Larsa, 19 inches tall. She's a little bit larger. And she's a cult statue from a shrine, and she's the goddess of life and death. She holds that cord in her hand. She can just snuff you out. She's standing on the body of lions, felines, the power animals, owls, the bird of wisdom on either side, and the bird of the night on either side. She has the talons of a great bird. See her feet? Talons of great bird. She wears the headdress of the rulers of Mesopotamia, male and female. So already the symbolic repertoire is making its way through these civilizations with these very, very significant women and goddesses emerging. Then, as we jump, and I'm skipping Egypt, I'm skipping Greece because it's in a matter of time, but I think you get the point that we're going from an early civilization like Mesopotamia, and of course in Egypt and Greece as well, where women goddesses are ubiquitous. There are lots of them. They're very, very important. And then with the Christian era, that all changes, because all of a sudden Eve becomes the enemy. And it all changes. So the snake that was associated for generations with fertility, with the cycles of life, with resurrection, with the woman, she controlled the snake, all of a sudden becomes, like the serpent. And, Eve couldn't resist him. So it all changes. The whole discourse about women and the goddess changes. And then it is supplanted by the Virgin Mary, who's pious and humble and represents a completely different image of woman than, say, Lilith, who was the original wife of Eve, and her story is pretty scary. It's the goddess of life and death. So we get into the Christian period. And in this particular, the early Christian period, you don't have a lot of independent artists. Artists are working in guilds, and women are not allowed in the guilds. So we just dismiss that. But women, however, do manuscript illumination, especially if they're in the convents. In other words, they will copy the Bible and do the beautiful pictures associated with the Bible. We know that there were women doing this, nuns in convents. We know that Charlemagne's sister was a wonderful manuscript illuminator, very, very famous. And he was famous for translating so much of the biblical literature, and she would illustrate for him. We also know Hildegard of Bingen, an extraordinary woman who was like the abbess of her own convent. She too was a great artist. So we do know that there's, but still they're working small, right? We're talking about books here. When we get into the early Renaissance and the Renaissance, the art gets bigger, more life-size, more realistic, and a new demand emerges. The demand from a new patronage. A patronage that has money, that wants to have art in their homes because it's status, and who look, again, at the image of women. Oh, it's so pretty to have a woman's picture in your house. It's also interesting that continuing from this early Christian period into the Middle Ages, women lose more and more respect. And it's kind of contradictory, because this is supposed to be the age of humanism, where you're supposed to encourage the education of everybody, and but the women are still second-class citizens here, because they're so limited as to what kind of education they can have. They did create some women's schools at this time. The more enlightened, privileged families, these are not public schools where the kid down the block goes to school. These are privileged schools. And the noble women even had tutors. So they did educate the women, but remember, they're educating them in certain subjects and not others. A woman was expected to play a musical instrument. She was expected to write and read poetry. She was expected to entertain in sort of a salon environment. She was expected to be a good companion. So sewing was very important too. And beautiful works emerge as a result of this that not now, but for many years were just described as the decorative arts, not the fine arts, just the decorative women's work. In this period of time, as women's virtues were described as chastity and motherhood and the private domain of the family, women become the represented, not the representor. They're not painting. They're represented. They're the subject of the art. So when we go from the 12th, the 13th, to the 14th, 15th centuries, we don't know about the women. What we do know is they're falling further and further behind things we take for granted. So the Renaissance comes along, and one of the great accomplishments of the Renaissance was science. The scientific application of mathematical, theoretical principles into the making of a composition. We take it for granted. We all know how to make 3D, right? You have the railroad tracks and they go back. So that convinces us that that two-dimensional painting is three-dimensional, because we know how to do that. Children know how to do that. We take it for granted. A woman couldn't study science or math. They would know about the theory of perspective. So the men who know about this are able to create compositions, able to create images that look so realistic. And the example that I'm showing you is Masaccio's Trinity of 1425, where he creates in this work what we describe maybe as trefoil. He's tricking the eye, right? Trefoil. You see this, you go to visit this chapel. This isn't a chapel. It's flat. It looks like a chapel, right? Don't you think you're looking at a chapel? But you're not. It's flat because he has imitated exactly marble, fluted pilasters, the Roman arch, the medallions of ancient Rome, the coffered ceiling of the Pantheon, Renaissance. So they're studying Renaissance architecture. If you can't go outside and look at the Roman ruins and study art, you don't know this. So you don't know the classical vocabulary, and if you don't know the classical vocabulary, you can't be a Renaissance artist, because the Renaissance is based on the classical vocabulary. So again, women, they don't have this ability. Okay? So here he's painting the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. There's a little ghost little dove right there. And it's very realistic. He has people, patrons, the patrons are here on a parapet, in front of the saints, in front of the cross, in front of the figure of God the Father, in front of this tunnel. This is flat. It isn't real. He doesn't, because he has been taught about the theory of perspective. He's been taught about vanishing points and how things move back to a certain point on the horizon. So everything is highly calculated in the Renaissance, the composition. Highly, highly calculated. And very complicated. This is mathematics. And this is actually a simple composition. Imagine doing it in like a continuous narration where you have lots of things happening in the story. And you have to set up the perspective, the vanishing points, the distances, the spatial integration of one to another. If you don't go to a class and have somebody telling you how to do that and understand the mathematics, you can't do it. So, you get the point here. So women were on the fringe of this great cultural renaissance. They're restricted. They can't paint nudes. They can't paint compositions. They're not allowed to do grand scale compositions. And painting, well, one of the reasons they can't do it is because they're probably painting in a bedroom that's the size of, you know, a closet. So, you know, where are they going to set up their studio? You have to be very noble, very privileged to have the space to do something that is grand. Instead, women are the muse. Women are the subject. Women are beautiful. And Botticelli's women are extraordinarily beautiful. Here you have, again, a continuous narration with La Primavera, the birth of spring, with all of these things happening within this composition. So if we thought Masaccio was complicated, this is really complicated, because now you've got background and landscape and foreground and middle ground and the figures integrating with each other and the figures integrating with the background. The compositions get more and more complex and out of the realm of somebody who's not taking a class. It's interesting that in the 15th century, there are many illustrious women in history that more and more are being recognized. And there are books written about them, and they're sort of coming out of their sort of lack of historical construct. But we know. How about Queen Isabella? I mean, how much more powerful do you get than Queen Isabella? Here we are in America. Hello. Pretty important woman. How about Catherine de' Medici? The Medici and Catherine beginning the legacy in France. She's pretty important too. Isabella d'Este was the greatest collector in Europe in her time. She rivaled everybody. She out-collected the kings. She was the equivalent of the king. She was so rich and so powerful and set the standards, set the styles. Do you think that they had women painting for them in their courts? Yes, they did. Do you know who they are? So let's look at some of these women that probably some of you know, maybe not. The most important woman portraitist of the 16th, early 17th century was Sophonisba Anguissola. Famous in her own right, the most important portrait painter. She worked for royalty and she worked for the popes. She had an amazing career. Her legacy in the documents of this particular period include testimonials, comments, biographies from not only the great historians and art historians of the period, but of course the biographers of royalty and popes. Why? Because she's there painting their portraits. And she had like a salon where artists would come and visit her. and talk about, well, I went to see Sophonisba today because I was having trouble with my backswing. You know, how you go to a, well, she was the person that they would ask, and I'm talking about Rubens, Van Dyck, important artists. So here, so she's working in the court of the Habsburgs. She was called to Madrid, she works in their court, and she documents the princesses, the queen and the king. She was especially good with a number of things. First of all, you notice there's not a great amount of background to this. The women didn't know how to do a lot of backgrounds. So instead they concentrated on the foreground, and they concentrated on what they could do best. In her case, cloth. She knew how to capture the cloth, the jewels and the cloth. So she, now these poor little girls, dressed like this, posing for their portraits. One thing that was really nice about having a woman court painter is that the kids are very comfortable with her. She's very comfortable. She was, when she arrived in Spain, she arrived with an entourage of 20 ladies in waiting. She was not a poor, starving artist. She herself was an aristocrat. She came with her own entourage. So she knows what fork to use. She knows what to say and not what to say. She knows how to treat royalty and what her expectations are. So she's really comfortable in the court, and they're comfortable with her. Here's Isabella. So here you see her as a baby, a young girl. She's grown up. One of the most coveted ladies in the royal families. Now, how does the King of Spain get this message out to the King of England or France or Austria that he has this gorgeous daughter and they want to make a deal? Right? Listen, you have all this land and I have all this land and we got to get it together, so I'll send you my daughter. She'll marry your son, right? That's the way it was done. How does he sell this story? With portraits. And the portrait painter has to be able to make everybody look beautiful. And if she happens to be very beautiful, but you know, some of them are not that beautiful. You know, the Habsburgs, as we go along in time. But she knows how to detract from any of those physical failings by the jewels and the garments and the dresses. So what do you see first? You see the beautiful lace ruff. You see the jewels. You mean, this is exquisite. So this is what the women had to do. They had to master something that would idealize almost without too much. So here's Phillip II. This is one of the greatest portraits of Phillip II. Do you know that a woman did this? Okay. See, I told you were going to learn something. So here he is. The Habsburgs are very strict. They're very severe. He always dressed in black. A little bit of white lace. He's not a personality. And if he is a personality, he's not a personality that you and I are going to know. This is not for us. No, this is a royal portrait. She had to be able to do that. She had to be able to portray this king, the most important man in the world, 1565. You know, if we were in 1565, he'd be our king. So here's the most important man in the world, very severe, very, very serious. And it's her job to get that message across without distracting from it with frivolity. It's not like Louis XIV. Right? How about Artemisia Gentilissimi? Now, you probably know who she is because a movie was made about her. And her story is so sensational that she comes down as maybe the third artist in the books. Artemisia in the school of Caravaggio, her father was a painter, also very... Now the idea that these women had parents, brothers, fathers, grandfathers as painters is very important because they have an opportunity that an ordinary person doesn't have. So Artemisia Gentileschi's father, Orazio, was a very important painter in the period in the school of Caravaggio. So here's Artemisia, another self-portrait. They all paint self-portraits, not just the women, but the men. They're demonstrations. You paint yourself, and then you say to your client, look, this is what I can do. They didn't have a camera, so they painted themselves to demonstrate. So she is demonstrating how she can do this sort of iridescence on the sleeve of her dress, that she's really creative. She's not all dressed up, like, you know, like she's going to a ball, as we're going to see some of the women are. She's really painting. Skin tones, hair. She's saying, I can do all of this. I can do all of this. When we get to the Netherlands, the artists are extremely skilled, because in the Netherlands you have a different culture. You have a mercantile culture. And so it wasn't about nobility or popes. It was about the merchant. And the merchants wanted works to decorate their homes to show that they were successful. They didn't want religious paintings because they're Protestants, and religious painting had to be very small. They didn't have major altarpieces, so all of a sudden the women say, listen, so I can't do a big altarpiece. Yeah, in the Netherlands I don't have to do it. Nobody wants big altarpieces anymore. So they can compete in genre paintings, paintings of a specific subject. One of the most popular subjects were flower painters, flower paintings. Why? Who brought the flower market to the world? The Dutch, the tulip trade. Who did the first, what we would call, conservatories for the growing of flower? The Dutch. They were all over the world, and they brought back these exotic plants, like tulips, and then they said, oh, well, that was really good in the West Indies, but what the heck are we going to do it in Holland, where it's cold and it's damp and we never see the sun? Well, they build a hothouse. So not only do they build the hothouse, but they study botanically the flowers. So the Dutch were very much in the forefront of all of this. The artist Rachel Ruysch, whose father was a botanist, was more successful than Rembrandt and commanded higher prices. So imagine that. This is an example of one of her flower still life. It's a total demonstration of all of the developments, genetic developments of flower breeding, variegated flowers. You know, we can buy those in Publix, but the Dutch were the first ones to do a flower petal or a different variety of flowers. They knew how to do them, they grow them, they studied, and she studied with her father. So she was not really prolific, she didn't paint a lot, she had a big family, she had a lot of kids, her husband was an artist, he ended up doing the framing for her, but she was incredibly successful. And as I said, was more popular in her day than Rembrandt, and I bet you never heard of her. Here's another example. So her father is a botanist, and also a professor who taught science and biology in the college there. And guess what she did? She was his illustrator. Again, no cameras. So when you're a scientist, you have to have somebody by your side drawing it. So she was by his side at all of these weird little things that he would bring home, kinds of bugs and lizards. You know, a lot of this stuff doesn't grow in Holland. But as a scientist, he brought it to the lab, and she drew it. So she became very, very skilled illustrating all of these details. And then, when she wanted to sit down and paint a painting, and they're big, these flower paintings, she had all of the skills to do something really unusual, which made her work in such demand. As we continue into the 19th century, and in this case the early years of the 20th century, of course we're introduced to Impressionism, another very significant ism in the history of art. And there were women impressionists not only were there women impressionists, but two of them, this is Mary Cassatt, of course she was a very important member of the Impressionists, but she was invited to be an Impressionist by Degas and didn't exhibit with them until 2 years after their first exhibit in 1864. Famous for Mothers and Children. Again, a woman is inside, she's familiar with the subject, the children relate nicely to her, so it was easy for them to master. Bertha Morisot, in her self-portrait, Bertha Morisot was actually one of the organizers of Impressionism. She was with the group on the left bank who decided to borrow a friend's gallery and show their paintings because they were so vilified in society at that time. Bertha Morisot was married to Manet's brother, and one of the founding members of the group. She was pretty important. Here's a work by Morisot. The Cradle, a wonderful subject. And I mean, I could go on about this subject for a long time because it always infuriates me to read that when Morisot and Cassatt did the subject of the Cradle, which they did often, they were dismissed by the critics, saying, oh, that's just feminine work, that's just, woman stuff. But Monet and Renoir did extraordinary paintings of their wives, of friends, just like this, with the Cradle. They weren't vilified. That wasn't female work. So, we always have these little contradictions here. How about Suzanne Valadon? A real character. She was actually a circus artist, a trapeze artist. She fell, she broke her leg. She was beautiful, and she modeled. And she would sit and model, and she figured out, you know what, I can learn to do this. And she was modeling for Renoir. You can probably recognize Renoir. This is her portrait by Renoir. But this is a subject that you see often in Renoir's paintings. She's the model. She's the model for Degas. She's the model for Toulouse-Lautrec. And all the while that she's sitting there as the model, they're teaching her how to paint. So she becomes a painter in her own right. But look what she's painting. This is shocking. In the early years of the century, to paint, for a woman, it's okay for a man, we've been doing it for centuries. For a woman to paint a female nude, shocking. She did. These wonderful subjects that she captured. How about this? A black nude woman in 1919? Really shocking. So here is an example of a very independent woman, very popular, very successful, highly respected among that group in Paris at the time. So fast forward into the 20th century. New rights for women. Art schools still limit the number of women. The Omri Show, 1913, brings modernism to America, first to New York. The war brought artists to New York, like Hans Hofmann, and women work side by side with men, but few are recognized. By the time we get to the 70s, the feminist movement is changing this whole story that I just told you in 5 minutes. And they're bringing attention to women, not only women artists, but women. Women in literature, women in science, women pioneers, women, everything. And it begins with Judy Chicago and her California students. The first course related to women in art, feminist art, was taught by Judy Chicago in California. And she really leads the way. She teaches her students to do research, to put these women back into history. Otherwise, we couldn't teach this course. I wouldn't know who these women were. She encouraged them to create and curate exhibits and to write about the women artists. The Guerrilla Girls that followed, they continue the message. In fact, they continue the message to this day, because they were the ones who recognized that women still had not come a long way. There were still few women in the exhibits, in the in the museums. Let me get rid of that thing. The Guerrilla Girls did posters, they demonstrated, they really brought the attention of the world to the plight of the woman artist. And they did so by putting on a mask of a gorilla. It's funny. So they used humor and irony. And they did this because they didn't want anybody to say, oh, you're bringing attention to yourself. You know, some reporter to say, oh, look, there is Bertie Steinbaum, who was a gorilla girl. And there she is, and she just wants everybody to go visit her gallery. So rather than do that, they don these masks and they become totally anonymous and they take the name of a famous person. So, you know, that might be George O'Keeffe, that might be Artemisia, that might be Cleopatra. They call themselves something else in order to bring the attention of the world to them. And this is some of the work that they did, some of the posters that proliferated as they became more and more vocal and visible. They really went after everything. So I think this gives you a pretty good idea what their story is. It's interesting because these are old posters.
Yeah, I see him. He's not around anymore.
No, but the story is still around, isn't it?
Yeah.
We haven't come a long way.
No. It's still.
Yeah, the story is still there. So anyway, to wrap it up, I want to tell you a little bit about the museum and what we're doing today and what we're doing tomorrow. Whoops.
Before you start, the only woman artist that I can recall being mentioned in art history class was Rosa Bonheur.
Rosa Bonheur, right.
And nobody ever talks about her anymore.
Well, you know, Rosa Bonheur even made it into the scene. She dressed as a man.
Ah, okay.
So she would, you know, present her work dressed as a man.
What's her period? I don't know.
Rosa Bonheur, French Impressionist. She used to do animals,
A lot of horses.
and field landscapes.
Yeah, very, very important artist.
Yeah.
But it's the story that is told so often that somebody goes and sees a work of art, and I mean, it's the old Lee Krasner, Jackson Pollock story that the collectors go and in their studio and they see a work of art, and they say, oh, I really want that. And then the dealer says, well, that's Krasner and that's Pollock. You can't buy this one. You have to buy this one. But you can't tell the difference. And the customer didn't care. They wanted that painting. But Rosa Bonheur was the same thing. She dressed as a man. She presented her work. She never let anybody know she was a woman. It was very successful. So anyway, this is the work of Ursula von Reitensberg. It's upstairs that I said I would give you a little bit of a peek if you want to in a minute. The work, as you can see just by this particular image, is monumental, epic, majestic, huge. I think you're going to find it quite astonishing. And she just won a very important award, this Art Critics Annual Award, in which she considers like the Pulitzer Prize for artists. So she just won it. So we're so proud to have the exhibit that won that award here. And there she is in front of my favorite work. Here we are installing the work. The work took 8 guys for a whole week to install. Then the next exhibit coming up is Lynn Golub-Gelfman's exhibit. Maybe some of you know her. She's a Miami artist. We always do a Florida artist series. So her work is coming up in May. And they're really very, very beautiful, large paintings that are inspired by aerial views of ruins. They're inspired by a desert area that she went to in Brazil. The surfaces are really quite extraordinary. Alex Tremino is an MFA student who we just presented with the Betty Leonard Perry Award. Her work is up on the 3rd floor, and she works with fluorescent tubes and fibers and these sort of multimedia installations. It's really a great exhibit. It comes down tomorrow, so if you want to go up to the 3rd floor and see it, you should. Here's an example of a shot into her installation. We had the Tour de France, some of the artists that were in that. Maria Teresa Negreiros, also a very beautiful exhibit. Maria Teresa is from Brazil. She was born in the Amazon. She now lives in Colombia, and she's inspired by the Amazon River and the destruction of the Amazon. We just took this down, but it was one of our most beautiful shows, right? Huge paintings. The paintings are bigger than the screen. And they're about the fires in the Amazon. They were really spectacular paintings. Let's see, what else do I have? Sculpture part. Of course, we have the work of a number of women, including Elisa Aramani, who, just in case you know Rosa Sobrante, she's Rosa Sobrante's mother from Barcelona. Rosa very much of a great supporter of the arts in Miami. So I think here we're doing in the fall, Annie Wharton, who used to live in Miami and is a video artist. She is going to be curating an exhibit of works of female video artists from Miami collections. And so thank you very much. Any questions?